Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, the fourth in a series of webinars from the Centre for the Advancement of Positive Behaviour Support at Bild. The aim of the webinar series is to support the development of PBS practice, and we are grateful to the Department of Health, NHS England, and Skills for Care for their support. Today's webinar is about practice leadership, getting PBS right at the front line. Our presenters are Professor Lowe and Dr. Edwin Jones, who are both service improvement and research leads in the Mental Health and Learning Disabilities Delivery Unit at the Abertawe Bro-Morgannwg University Health Board, with key roles in service improvement, training and research, focusing on positive behaviour support and active support. Together they've co-developed 3 accredited e-learning qualifications in PBS. They both hold senior visiting positions at the University of South Wales and the International University of Catalonia, Barcelona. Professor Lowe is involved in several advisory groups on the development of learning disability and challenging behaviour services, and Dr. Jones chairs the All Wales Challenging Behaviour Community of Practice and is a member of the Welsh Government's Learning Disability Advisory Group. I'd just like to quickly remind you that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so do send in your questions during the presentation and use the entry box at the bottom of your screen. The presentation slides will be available after to download on the Bild website at bild.org.uk/CAPS-webinars, an address that will appear on the screen at the end of this webinar. I'd now like to hand you over to Edwin and Kathy.
Good morning. I'm Edwin Jones. We're very pleased you can join us this morning.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Lowe. We're going to talk about the importance of practice leadership in maintaining and enhancing quality in learning disability services, with particular emphasis on the implementation of positive behaviour support. We'll describe some useful practice leadership tools that are quite easy to use and have been shown to have very beneficial effects.
I'll start with some key basic points. An important concept in PBS is to try and put ourselves in the shoes of the people we support. So let's call this man Edwin. He has a relatively common range of challenging behaviours. If he's very lucky, he could live in a good service. And research tells us there are several common elements that characterise good quality services. These include, of course, practice leadership, but also multidisciplinary support, training in relevant skills, such as central to our model would be positive behavioural support, which obviously is a person-centred approach that starts with understanding the person and the reason why they have challenging behaviour, or the function of the challenging behaviour. It's got a proactive focus, so the main emphasis is on primary prevention and improving environments so people don't need to use challenging behaviour to get what they want. Active support is a key component of primary prevention, and also elements of secondary prevention, what we do when somebody becomes agitated. Ethical reactive strategies are also an element in our model, but only with an active policy of reducing restrictive practices. However, unfortunately, Edwin may not be so lucky. In fact, it may be more likely that he lives in a poor service, such as the one shown in red. Again, research tells us that there are elements common to poor quality services, which are in many ways opposite to those on the green side. So, we have only administrative managers, people who mainly spend a lot of time on paperwork or in the office, not with the people who are receiving the service. There's very limited external support. There may be training, they may not be that relevant to the actual practice. Rather than have positive behavioural support, there's no clear approach. Rather than being person-centred and the people who use the service, it's really centred on the needs of staff. There aren't any clear plans really, and what they have is in place of a proactive focus to prevent challenging behaviour, they have a reactive focus that they intervene only after challenging behaviour has occurred, and we tend to see high levels of challenging behaviour in these environments, and there's a high use of restraint because the staff are constantly trying to firefight the high incidence of challenging behaviour. Apart from when they're displaying challenging behaviour, service users often spend most of their time doing nothing, and the staff support structures are inadequate, the decision-making structures are inadequate, and what we see here is very stressed staff. So, if we are to ask, if we went along and to ask managers of the service, how challenging is Edwin? We tend to see this Jekyll and Hyde phenomenon. If I go to the green service and ask, does Edwin have challenging behaviour? I'm likely to be told no, not now. He used to be labelled as having severe challenging behaviour in the past, but since he's lived here, he's fine. In contrast, if I go and ask the manager of the red service that Edwin is unfortunately in, I'm told, or I'm more likely to be told, yes, his challenging behaviour is getting worse. He's really difficult to manage. He's dangerous. We can't cope with him. We've had more staff, but that hasn't worked. He needs to go to a secure hospital setting. All we're pointing out here is that nothing has changed internally in Edwin. The difference lies in the support environments that he's in. So we know what good support looks like. It's the green service, and an important factor is practice leadership. We like this image, developed by colleagues in United Response, a UK service provider who've been very active in implementing active support, positive behavioural support, and developing practice leadership in their organisation. We really like the image because it represents the complexity of the role and helpfully identifies two main themes. So, direct guidance is one of those themes, and in that they describe the need for practice leaders to role model skills and the behaviour expected of the staff they support themselves. In addition, there's a key role in coaching staff, in observing staff actually working and feeding back to staff to help reinforce good practice and solve any problems. They need to have a focus, they need to help to focus the team to help with team consistency. And another role is organising the staff team to provide support when and how people need and want it, to get the right staff with the right skills in the right place. The second key theme in yellow is showing the way. Here the role involves developing a shared vision and values amongst all team members. And I really like that emphasis on translation. That's about translating often quite complex and diverse advice, guidance and requirements into actual good practice by that team. So making things understandable and straightforward. Another key role is the need for them to review and improve effectiveness. So a monitoring role. And finally, all of this is about motivating staff. It's about making sure that staff are actually implementing things like active support and the wider PBS model and ensuring they have the right skills to do that. I'm now going to hand over to Kath.
Now, if we think about the PBS process, There are usually three main stages in developing the support for individuals. The first is preparation. We need to gather a lot of information to understand the person and their environment. For people with challenging behaviour, we also need to undertake a functional assessment to understand why the person uses challenging behaviour to get the things they need. Now, this step is often led by external professionals. Although it can and should involve the staff within the service, very often it's external professionals who do the lead on this. The second step is planning the actual support. Things like developing PCP goals, designing the PBS plan, and the daily planning elements of active support. This step, too, is often undertaken by a mixture of people, internal and external to the service. The third step is actually implementing all of this. Staff need training. We need to ensure that plans are being put into place accurately, and we need to assess the quality of the support provided. Now, this step can only be undertaken by staff within the service, and this is where practice leadership really comes into its own. As Edwin said, when he talked about the United Response graphic, managers as practice leaders need to be champions for PBS. They also need to be skilled themselves in providing the direct support to service users. They need to spend a lot of time, not in the office, but working alongside staff, and they need to be observing practice. Practice leaders are in the best position for teaching and for helping staff to develop their practice. And the best way they can do this is by acting as role models. So, thinking about the third stage of implementation, the key responsibilities of practice leaders are in training, in helping the staff to understand what they need to do in order to provide the correct support to the people they're helping. Practice leaders are also responsible for accuracy, for ensuring that staff implement the positive behavioural support plans consistently and accurately as they're designed. They're also responsible for quality, for supporting the staff team to set and achieve standards, to maintain quality and to push quality forward. We'll look at training first. Now, we've known for decades that a combination of different training techniques that are reinforced by ongoing management attention is the most effective type of training there is. Gary Lavinia, back in 1994, outlines a very helpful model for helping staff to achieve competence in the workplace. The first stage of training is verbal competence. This is when staff can say what they think they should be doing. Now, this is normally achieved by reading a document or listening to a presentation. Unfortunately, this is often the only training that staff get, but on its own, it's insufficient. It does nothing to actually shape practice. The second stage is role play, where staff practice what they should do in a classroom or workshop situation. Now, we know some services do this, and although they may initially resist this, staff generally find that this is helpful, as this stage involves learning by doing, not just reading or listening. The final step is the most important, however, and unfortunately, this is rarely done. This in vivo step involves taking the training right into the workplace, working with the people they support in the real environment. In active support, we call this stage interactive training. And we know from research that without this element, training is not effective in changing staff behaviour. Now, interactive training needs to be carefully prepared and structured, and Edwin will talk about this now.
This is quite a busy slide, but it summarises the stages and process of in situ interactive training that we've developed when we implement the active support model. However, it's relevant to all aspects really of PBS plan implementation and training staff. So the easiest way of thinking about this is that it happens in the person's home if that's where they receive staff support. The first stage really is the trainer briefly describes the process to the staff member. Now, prior to this step, it's really important that they've had some work on the other two steps, so they know the basic elements of the interactive model in active support. And, you know, they've had a little go at role-playing some of that. So that's happened already. So this first stage then of finalising the plan and agreeing that the content is basically a little reminder to staff about that. And then the staff, we like to give the staff a bit of choice about which service user they're going to interact with and what activities they're going to use as training examples. And we can use other elements of the staff of the active support model here just to run through that with staff, such as the daily participation plan. The whole objective is that this isn't aversive to staff. We're not coming in to test and criticise. We're coming in to help, support and develop good staff practice. So, after we've decided which person they're going to interact with and what activities they're going to do, the staff member carries on and does that. And as a trainer, I would simply observe, but I would observe with a purpose and take some notes about the extent to which they're helping the person to engage in activities. The third stage then of initial performance feedback is where, as a trainer, I would discuss with the staff member their interaction with the person they support. I always start off, and this is a very important point, by highlighting everything that they did well. And once you practice this technique and you're clear about what you're observing, that's not a problem. The problem is if you've been in a culture where that never happens and you have to change your own behaviour as a trainer to do that. So we talk a lot about everything that the staff member did well. And then, if required, we can ask a simple question such as, if you're going to do that again, would you do it any differently? And often they've picked an activity that they've done several times before and it all goes fine, so that there's no need, there's not much to improve. But if there is, and we ask that question, often staff are very self-critical. And really all we have to say is, well, actually, it was really good. Yeah, and we're highlighting always what the staff member did well. But we can talk about ways of improving if there's some obvious ways. The next stage, though, is that we talk about doing a new activity, something that they haven't done before. So this is this is the fourth one down on the table, called observation of interaction. So here we talk to the staff member and prepare them to do a new, possibly a more complex activity with the service user. And again, we observe, we provide feedback. So we're down on the fifth row about performance feedback, where again, we start off with detailed discussion about everything they did right before we move on to talking about any ways of improving. And if we do talk about ways of improving, we make sure that's very constructive, very practical, and that we're actually helping them to solve problems, not simply criticizing them. Then we tend to repeat those stages over several activities, and this depends obviously on the people involved, but we repeat that until both we as trainers feel the staff member is competent and has learned from the session, and then we would end the session again with just a quick summary of everything that they did well, and perhaps a little discussion about anything that we could improve with concrete suggestions of how to do that. So, I said that we observe with a purpose, and the observation we do informs the feedback we give. So feedback is essentially given on preparation, how they prepared the setting, did they have everything in place. Then, how they presented the activity to the service user. We're looking for none of this. If it's aversive to the service user, to put it simply, it's not active support. So we're looking for a positive presentation, perhaps not too detailed. It depends on the person they're supporting. Then we talk about the ways they help the person, the levels of assistance, the task analysis, and those things. Then we would talk about reinforcement. What did they do to positively reinforce the service user when they engaged in the activity? And then finally, we have a bit of a kind of catch-all category, which is very important, on style. And this can cover everything from tone of voice, body language, and general approach. Again, I'm sorry, a very busy slide. And we developed this as a useful crib sheet or set of prompts to remind us what, and to give to the people we're training, to remind them what they should be looking for when they're observing. And also, these are the key areas on which they should structure their feedback. I'm not going to read all of this, and it is really just a crib sheet for people who've had a lot of training in the theory of this. But we're more than happy to answer any questions that you'd like to send in about this or anything else in the webinar. The key message that we want to emphasize throughout is the need to provide positive feedback. So telling the staff what they did right, because we want to reinforce the types of staff behaviour we want to strengthen, because we want the staff to do this on an ongoing basis after the training session, for it to become part of their normal working practice. I'm now handing you back to Kath.
Now we've looked at training, we'll move on to accuracy and quality. We're going to show you two tools for practice leaders to use. The first tool is something called positive monitoring, and this is a method for checking the accuracy of implementation and is another way as well of giving staff regular positive feedback on their performance in the workplace. The second tool is called periodic service review, and this is a method for setting standards to improve service quality, and we'll explain both of these now. Right, positive monitoring. Once PBS plans have been developed and the staff are trained in them, the next stage is to put them into operation. Management's attention should now switch to checking the accuracy of implementation, and this is where positive monitoring comes in. So the key components of positive monitoring are defining and clarifying service aims and outcomes for the service users, It's also specifying very clearly what staff should do to achieve these service aims. The aim of positive monitoring is to help staff to work in the specified way, and this entails regularly observing staff while they're working. It's also a method of providing very specific feedback to individual staff members, and is a very useful and tangible way of reviewing individual job performance. So once staff are trained, managers need to stay in touch with the way staff operate, and regular observation is really the best way of doing this. Without this, it's very easy for small problems to go unnoticed until they can become quite serious. The observations should include how all the elements of the PBS plan are being put into practice, and they should be done in a structured and systematic way. This means that any observation should be related directly to the PBS plan itself. And one way of ensuring this is to design a positive monitoring observation form for each PBS plan. Managers need also to ensure that they spread their observations evenly across the staff team, so that they get a good understanding of how the team operates overall. Feedback should also always, though, be done on an individual basis. Now, the way to construct a positive monitoring form is to design it on each individual's PBS plan. Specifying the precise way in which staff should work to achieve the aims for individual service users is one of the key functions of the PBS plan. The plan should address all the key procedures that staff will need to follow in order to support the service user in the best way possible. And although these practices are written down, the practice leader plays a crucial role in ensuring that all staff understand them. Adopting a collaborative approach and involving staff as much as possible in writing and reviewing the procedures also helps to make sure that they remain valid and are written in a clear, precise, and useful way. So, on the positive monitoring form, elements from all aspects of the plan should be included. And I'll give you an example of how this can be done. This slide just shows an extract from a positive monitoring form, the kinds of things that should be included. The first thing to note is that they're individualized for each service user based on the elements taken from the PBS plan. This is just an extract, and the forms are usually 2 or 3 pages long so that they can cover all the different elements. So easy things like, is the daily participation plan followed? Has the person prepared their own breakfast? Using them is simple. The practice leader arranges a supervision, an observation with the staff member. It's not just sprung on people. The intention is to catch the staff doing the right thing, not to catch them out. Observations can vary in length, but the maximum is about an hour or so. So the practice leader observes the staff member working with the service user and then notes down all the items that should have happened during the observation and all the things that did happen. Now, you wouldn't expect everything on the PBS on the positive monitoring form to be observed in a single session. For example, if it's in the afternoon, you wouldn't expect to see someone preparing breakfast. There's also a column on the positive monitoring form for notes, and this allows the practice leader to make specific notes that they will use in order to give feedback to the staff member. At the end of the observation, the practice leader just adds up the columns. So here you can see that during this observation, 25 actions should have been implemented and 21 were implemented. And this shows that the plan was implemented with 84% accuracy, which is not bad. As in interactive training, the key point of positive monitoring is to give positive feedback, which means highlighting all of the things the staff member did right. Now, if any areas of need were identified, these should be discussed with the staff member, as well as any further actions that might be needed. And then the next observation date would be set. Now, as Edwin said, we can't emphasize enough the importance of describing to the staff member all of the actions they did correctly, because this is the behaviour we're wanting to reinforce. Now, when it comes to noting any areas of need, the practice leader needs to constructively suggest ways of solving any problems, rather than just highlighting them as criticisms or as reprimands, because this just won't reinforce the behaviour we want staff to repeat. The emphasis must always be on what they've done right.
Remember, please don't send any questions you'd like us to answer on any of this content. Now, I'm going to talk about periodic service review, a way of maintaining service quality developed by Gary Lavinia again. This too should be a constructive process. If it isn't, to be honest, it's not periodic service review. I'll probably refer to it as PSR as I talk, so it's just the abbreviation. PSR is not something done to staff by an external expert or manager or inspector. Really, it must be done with staff, with the active participation of the staff team. It's another way of providing detailed positive feedback to the staff, but this time it's on a team basis, on the team level rather than the individual level, because Kathy's just explained that we use positive monitoring to do that. The objective with both approaches is to motivate staff. With periodic service review particularly, is to push up service, is to help staff to push up service quality themselves by them setting standards that are challenging to achieve. When we involve staff in setting standards, the standards are very relevant to that particular team and the people they support. The staff also own them. They're their own standards, and they tend to have more of a commitment to them. As I said, PSR is not done by external people, but it should be done regularly and frequently. It can be easily added into any regular staff meetings, for example, and the practice leader obviously has a role in establishing this system, but when it's running really well, the staff can do it even in the absence of the practice leader in their own meeting. So it's important that the way we do this, that the reviews are designed to only take a few minutes to complete. And also, as service quality improves, that the reviews change over time, or they change if new problems arise. We start by involving the staff in setting their own standards. A good way of explaining standards, I think, is to just say that they're a clear statement of what should happen, or a measurable statement about performance. Standards should include responsibilities for all the different key people involved, not just the support staff. So standards about practice leadership, for instance, should be there. Standards should be operationally defined. written in performance terms. A good way, it's not the whole story, but a good way of understanding what we mean by that is, could you see it or hear it? We want to avoid fuzzy statements that we think are actually very common in human services and replace those with very clear, specific ones. So a good way of doing this when writing a standard is to think about, to specify 4 key things. What should happen? When should it happen? Who is responsible? And how do we know that it has happened? In other words, how can it be verified? Again, this is just an extract, an example of a set of standards that is presented in the format of a score sheet. The important thing to remember is that you can't set standards for everything. This would quickly become unmanageable and quite aversive, really. So the intention with PSR is to set standards only for key current areas that the staff feel should be improved. And you can set smart standards that tell you a lot of information. Let's look at the first standard, for example. So that reads, a completed positive monitoring observation form that was administered within the last 5 weeks by the manager and shows a total score of 85% or over is available. Initially that can sound a little bit complicated, but when people have been involved in setting and discussing these, they're usually very familiar with it. So what this tells us in this just one standard is they've been trained in positive monitoring, it's being done on a regular basis, and that the accuracy, because of the score there in the standard, the accuracy of the PBS plan implementation is pretty high. It's quite good, in fact. Now, there's a lot of useful guidance in the PSR literature and in the training that we provide about clever or smart ways of setting standards. I'm not going to go into this now, but again, please remember we're more than happy to answer any questions you may like to send in about this or anything else that we talk about. I'm going to move on to verification now. There are 2 main forms of verification that we use in PSR. That's either by observation, seeing the performance or the behaviour happening, or the second is by examining a permanent product. And we don't want to make more work for staff. Rather, we want to use anything that's produced as a normal part of the team's work, in this case obviously around PBS. So examples of relevant permanent products we could use are participation records in the active support model, personal care routines, obviously PBS plans, daily participation plans, ABC charts. We can use other things if we're concerned with the way the team works and things. We can look at rotas, we can look at timesheets. But the key point is not to impose another bit of onerous paperwork just about the standards, really, but to use things that they would produce anyway. It's very important to be specific about how a standard is to be verified. As part of the PSR process, it's important that evidence is actually presented to verify that the standard has been achieved. Verification must be as straightforward as possible and should take the minimum amount of time. So thinking about this when writing the standard is very important. For example, in that first standard we looked at in the last slide, it said, is available. And one of the ways we define is available is that the staff can produce it within 5 minutes maximum. If they can't produce it within 5 minutes, it suggests to us it's either not there, or if it is there, it's not a working document that they use regularly, it's something filed away and forgotten. So that's just an example. Now, and just finally about PSR, I'm going to talk about the feedback and the scoring systems. So, the scoring system needs to be simple. If the verification process is clear, it should be very easy to say if the standard has been met or not. If it has been fully met, it scores 1. If any parts aren't met, then it scores a 0. However, in PSR terms, it's not a bad 0 score, but an O for opportunity to improve. And whilst that often sounds quite American, we know from our experience that if we get that message across, that's what makes PSR effective. What you want to avoid here is half scores, and it scores 0.75. Just keep it simple, keep it straightforward. It either is achieved or it isn't achieved. So the staff team goes through the standards themselves with support from the practice leader, and then they add up their final score. Then it's really important that the practice leader provides positive feedback and praise to the staff team on the standards that have been achieved. This should be a very key area of discussion, and a lot of talk about, well, how did we achieve it? And it's really good that it's been achieved, and really thinking about that and celebrating that. After that, but only after that, the discussion should move on to the O's for opportunity. And it's the practice leader's responsibility to help the team to solve any problems that have got in the way of them achieving the standard. This is called remedial action in the PSR literature. And when the right remedial action is identified and the practice leader helps the staff to implement it, this leads to higher scores the next time. A good way of providing visual feedback is to graph scores over time to demonstrate very clearly to the staff team how well they're doing. This can be very motivating for a team, but it must be done in the context of effective practice leadership and an understanding of PSR at all organisation levels. For example, if a senior manager who doesn't understand this sees the score sheet or sees that there's been a dip in the graph and then tells staff off for low scores and does not help to solve problems, then this isn't PSR. The system is being misused and becomes aversive and ceases to work. So remember, please send in any questions. We're more than happy to ask them. I'm now going to hand over to Kath just for the final slide.
Gary Lavinia, back in 1994, came up with a very useful phrase, that those who don't know how to manage are managing those who don't know what to do. And this is a situation that many of us have been quite familiar with. Blaming direct support staff for poor quality services is such a common response. But what research has shown time and time again is that the quality of management is a key factor in service quality and in staff performance. But it's no good just laying it all on managers, just to work out themselves how to improve quality. They too need structures to support and to guide their work. And these 3 systems that we've described this morning were designed just to do that. The 3-stage training model, positive monitoring, and periodic service review. Now, when managers become skilled in these tools and these processes, they cease to be administrative staff. They know how to do the job themselves. They can demonstrate that within their staff team which gives them credibility. They use evidence rather than hearsay to give feedback, and this feedback will be detailed, it will be accurate, it will be positive, and it'll resonate with the staff team. They also actively involve their staff in service quality and in having an interest in improving service quality. And this gives staff ownership of the whole process, which is very important. So when managers develop their skills in this, they don't remain as administrative staff tucked away in an office. They actually become practice leaders and are key in maintaining service quality. So now we've finished this presentation, let's move on to the questions.
I hope you found that useful. We've got some questions coming in, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer a few of those now. So we've got a really good question from Kelly Dobbin from the MAS about what practical advice and strategies can we offer to truly challenge deep-rooted views, beliefs and attitudes and team dynamics. So that's a very good question. Hopefully, Kerry, we did cover some practical tools in terms of the interactive training we talked about, which can have a very powerful impact, and also positive monitoring and PSR. Again, for us, through our experience, those are very practical. Obviously, people need to learn how to do them, and the best way of doing that, I would suggest, is to know the theory, but basically just have a go and learn by doing. Some things we didn't talk about in the presentation, which are obviously important around that, is the whole issue of values training, really. If we go back to that very good United Response graphic and slide we showed about practice leadership, it's about showing the way, really. So it's very important that perhaps we invest in practice leadership, knowledge and understanding around values, and also what they mean in practice. In our e-learning training, we do try and drill down to ask staff to think and go beyond the jargon of some of the value statements and think, well, what would you see? What does that really mean in practice? Another key thing for us is, embedded the starting point of PBS is that we should undertake a functional assessment and understand why a person has challenging behaviour. And if we do that well, and then we feed that back to staff, it becomes clear to them that the person isn't behaving in a difficult way just because they're bad or because they're trying to wind staff up, but because they're using the challenging behaviour to get important things, to get away from things, to escape, to get more social interaction, or to get things, and tangible things that are really important, or more stimulation. And when we do that well with the staff team and explain that, that can very powerfully change attitude. I'll hand over to Kathy now for some other questions.
Hello. We have a question from Jane Lingard about how people can access the 3 online learning items. Bild has already responded about being able to access the PBS awareness raising course on the Bild site itself. But I think Jane's referring to the PBS courses, the qualifications that we offer. And the best way, to access those, you need to be registered actually on the courses. And the best way of getting information about that is to contact the coordinator of the courses. And you can contact her by email at joanne.wheeler@wales.nhs.uk. But if you access the PBS awareness raising course on the Bild site, the last slide on that gives you all the details about the 3 courses and explains about them and gives you all the contact details as well. We have another question from Kim McNally, asking if there's any published research evidencing the use of positive monitoring, because she and a colleague are hoping to publish something using a similar process. There was some research doing on positive monitoring many years ago in the early 1980s, and that would be the lead author on that would be Jan Porterfield. We don't know of anything else recently. We've done some we've actually published a paper on PSR, but not on positive monitoring. Lately, a colleague has just registered to do a PhD using positive monitoring, but that research hasn't started yet. But we would be very interested to know of any research that you know of, and any research that's going to be happening on that.
Hi, it's Edwin again, and I got a good question from Luke Watts, who asks, can you use PSR in other areas other than directly on the support for the service users? And the short answer is yes. If there's a relevant issue for the staff team, then you can set standards about most areas. The only thing I'd caution about is that, I think we should be focusing on really what's relevant for service users. But on the example we showed in the presentation of the score sheet, there's one standard, number 5, on fire safety, just to highlight the point that Luke's raising, I think. And the standard there is the fire alarm log shows that the fire alarms were tested and a basic fire safety inspection was conducted within the last 7 days. So, that standard, fire safety is direct relevance to service users, but that's perhaps, a more general issue. And I'd also sort of just say the obvious, that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If that system is running fine and is really implemented well, then I wouldn't set a PSR standard about it. However, if the staff team and everyone have identified that's a problem, then yes, you can set a standard about it. I'll hand back to Kathy.
We have another question from Jane Lingard about how many services we know of that are using this way of working in the UK. And there's an increasing number. We have a community of practice within Wales, and a lot of the organisations across Wales are using this way of monitoring. We have local groups as well with local providers, where we're working on specific training for practice leaders. And the PBS Academy within the UK is coming up with competencies for practice leaders as well. So I hope that answers that question. I'll pass back to Edwin.
Damien McCulloch asks a good question around how do you tackle staff attitude when they don't really want to improve challenging behaviour because this interferes with their levels of overtime and extra shifts, etc. I think there's much wider organisational management things that need to be brought into play here. And I think it's the role of the practice leader really to focus the team, as again on the graphic, about what the job is really. It's a kind of a good question, Damien, but I think really it's about being clear about what we're giving overtime for, what we're rewarding, and having good staffing levels based on service user need to begin with, rather than firefighting challenging behaviour by continually adding more staff, really. So I think I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but perhaps other people would like to join the debate about that at some point. We've got several questions coming in, so I think we'll have. I'll hand over to Kathy for an answer to another one.
Now we have a question from Kevin Hefferman saying that monitoring and evaluation within the service on the floor can sometimes be inaccurate, and he suggests that this can be due to training on evaluation, but also carers' perception of the behaviour, particularly if it's violent, and how we combat this. Well, this really is the purpose of this presentation, because accuracy is needed, obviously, for proper monitoring and evaluation. And practice leaders need to spend time working alongside staff so they can actually see what's happening on the shop floor, rather than just relying on staff report. And that's where you get inaccuracies, because you get different perceptions, different ways of approaching. There are different staff behaviours. Practice leaders spending time. We've emphasised it's so important for practice leaders to spend time working alongside staff so they can actually see for themselves, which reduces inaccuracy. Also, reflecting on the behaviour, we've talked about training on evaluation, but carers' perceptions of the behaviour. Well, Edwin mentioned earlier on in answering those questions the importance with challenging behaviour of doing a full functional assessment, because if a full functional assessment is done, then that provides evidence, it provides concrete, tangible data which explains the function of behaviour. And that has a big effect on changing staff perceptions, changing carer perceptions, and developing a common understanding of why certain behaviours occur, why people behave in certain ways. And that's the way of combating that. I'll pass you on to Edwin now.
So we've got a good question from Andrew Lowe about how do you take into account individual staff's different styles when they're interacting with service users. And essentially, that can be quite a strength, really, because we don't want a kind of a robotic staff team who are all kind of clones of one another. You can't get that anyway. But what we try and focus on are the key elements of the positive interactive model. So, are staff varying the level of help? Are they breaking things down? And are they reinforcing, positively reinforcing when the service user participates in activity? Have they got a good tone of voice? All of these issues, good body language. So as long as those basic things are there, then there's scope for different styles. And essentially you talk to staff about the different styles and think if staff do it with a slightly different style, but that's very effective and it works, then that's really positive. The problem comes if one or two members of staff have a very different individual style, and when they work with service users, it's not as effective. So that's when you have to have conversations about changing style and talking about team consistency. And there's some nice techniques as well, I think, where you can use little video clips of staff who have a very good, successful style, and then look at that and talk about it as a group and think about perhaps how we can replicate some elements of that style, but maintain people's individual styles, wherever they're helpful. I think I'll hand back now to Kathy.
We have a question here from Carla Williams from Field Bay, suggesting that the model seems to be very time-consuming and asking how many practice leaders we think are necessary for effective implementation per service user. Well, we wouldn't say practice leaders per service user, but we would say that there need to be practice leaders within every setting. And in terms of it being time-consuming, we would ask really what the function of a service is. Because if the service's function is to provide good quality support, then we would argue that practice leadership is an integral role of managers or of shift leaders within any service. So if the managers or the shift leaders are not actually ensuring quality, ensuring accuracy, then what are they doing?
I'd like to come in and try and answer a couple of questions at once. So Sarah Leach from Bild is asking, how can we keep good practice leaders on the floor when they're often moved to administrative management issues and those that take priority? And I think it partly relates to Carla's question as well. I think organisations have to ask some fundamental questions about what are we managing? What is the focus of the work? And for us in PSR, the focus of the work is improving the quality of life of service users. So really, we should be focusing on that and using good, experienced management skills to focus on that rather than some of the administrative duties. So I think there's questions to ask as organisations try and cut costs and they expand. The continued delegation of administrative tasks to management, which seems to be very common, may not be the most sensible way of doing it, whereas the refocusing of the management task on the quality of life of service users, I would argue strongly, is really what we should be thinking about. Management of human services is different to management of some other services, really, and we should be clear about that. Another question which Laurie Lynn asks is, what would be the target number of practice leaders within a care facility, and what's the ratio of leaders to staff? Again, it's very hard to give a very concrete answer to this one, but I think that a good model is to ensure that the practice leader has sufficient time to work with the service users and the staff team within one setting. So I think that, you know, an ideal model is a practice leader for each staff team. Again, I think with as we have restrictions on costs and lots of other pressures on services, there's a tendency to spread management or practice leadership very thinly, and that's not that sensible, really. Some practice leaders I know manage 2 teams very effectively. Some don't. So I think you need to know your service users, know your staff really well, and know the practice leaders. As they get more experienced, then they can coach other people. But you know, I think it's if we're talking about working with people with severe challenging behaviour, then really we need to think through what are the most effective arrangements for that, and that will vary depending on the skills, experience, and the people involved, really. But you know, practice leaders need to be very accessible to the staff and service users that they work with, and need to have a big presence in the setting. And if organisational structures don't enable that, then I think organisations need to think about their structures and what they're requiring staff to do. Good practice leadership, I'd emphasise, is very cost and time effective, because it stops problems developing that become bigger and bigger and then require more resource allocation, or unfortunately placement breakdown and greater costs associated with that. So it's an invest to save model. I'll hand back to Kathy now.
We have a question here from Carla Williams about if there are any contacts who use PBS in mental health settings. We would emphasise that PBS is actually applicable to all vulnerable groups. In England, the Department of Health has got a Positive and Safe programme, which is emphasising the importance of PBS in services for all people who are vulnerable. That includes people with mental health, dementia, acquired brain injury, children, young people, children in care. etc. There is increasing work being done in mental health settings locally, and there are several papers that have been recently published. And if you Google Bronwen Davis, you'll see papers coming up, particularly about the introduction of PBS within Caswell Clinic, which is a forensic setting, which includes some people with learning disabilities, but not all with learning disabilities, but all with severe mental health problems.
Joe Tobin, who I think is from Ireland, has sent in a question about how can we positively support staff who decline to take service users, swimming or to church, etc., because of their own beliefs and perceptions, even though it's their opportunities. I think the start of positive monitoring, Joe, is to be very clear about staff role. So I think it's important that when we're recruiting staff, we're inducting them into the service, that we're very clear about what the role entails, and that we're requiring staff to support the service users in things that are important to them. So obviously there's an issue about matching staff attitude and skill to service user activity. So I wouldn't send somebody who couldn't swim to support people swimming. And I'd be talking to staff about that. However, I would be positively use my recruitment and induction, saying an important skill to have with these people is to be able to take them swimming. I'd also provide some practice leadership support in situ in those activities, because I know swimming can be it can be quite problematic at times. I think the issue when we get into issues about religion, and I've certainly had issues around vegetarianism, where staff, say that they're vegetarian and don't want to help service users prepare meat, although service users really like that. I think that's when I get, more clearly about, well, it's your role to support this person to do this, and really perhaps sometimes to leave your personal beliefs behind if it's obviously if it's an appropriate and legitimate activity for service users to do. So it's about putting service users first, not staff first. I'll hand back to Kathy.
Well, I think that's probably the end of the questions at the moment. So we'd like to hand back to Bild now.
On behalf of Bild and the Centre for the Advancement of Positive Behaviour Support, I'd like to thank Professor Kathy Lowe and Dr. Edwin Jones for today's excellent webinar. Can I just remind everyone that the slides for this presentation are now available to download from the Bild website at the address given on the screen. A link to watch this webinar in full on demand will also be available there at that address later, and everyone who registered for today's webinar will be sent an email with a link to watch the webinar again later. And that page that's on screen also gives information about the other webinars in our series. And registration for the next webinar by Dr. Andy McDonnell of Studio 3 on applying positive psychology to behaviour supports on the 30th of November is now open. And we look forward to you joining us for that one too. But finally, thanks again to Kathy Lowe and Edwin Jones for today's excellent presentation. Goodbye.